The train wheels clicked rhythmically against the rails, a soothing percussion that had accompanied you for the better part of 2 days as you journeyed westward from Denver. It was October of 1883, and the aspens had turned to gold along the mountainsides, their leaves trembling like countless coins in the autumn breeze. You sat in the worn velvet seat of the narrow-gauge railroad car, your trunk of precious equipment secured in the baggage compartment, watching as the landscape transformed from plains to foothills, and finally to the dramatic peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Your name was Margaret Whitmore, though in the circles you traveled, you were known as Madame Marguerite, a name that carried more mystery, more weight in the world of spiritualism that had become your calling. At 37 years of age, you had already established yourself as a respected medium in Chicago, conducting séances for grieving families who sought connection with their departed loved ones. But the silver boom in Colorado had created a unique opportunity, mining towns flush with wealth, populated by those far from home, many having lost friends and family to the dangerous work of extracting precious metals from the earth. Georgetown, your destination, was known as the Silver Queen of the Rockies, a prosperous mining town nestled at 8,500 feet above sea level in a valley surrounded by peaks that scraped the sky. The town had sent for you specifically, or rather, a group of prominent citizens had pooled their resources to bring a legitimate spiritualist to their community. The letter, written in an elegant hand on stationery from the Hotel de Paris, had promised suitable accommodation, a dedicated space for conducting séances, and a clientele eager for connection with the spirit realm. As the train began its descent into the valley, you could see Georgetown spread below like a carefully arranged collection of dollhouses. The late afternoon sun painted the wooden buildings in shades of amber and rust, while smoke from countless chimneys rose straight up in the still mountain air. The surrounding peaks, Gray's Peak, Torrey's Peak, and others whose names you had yet to learn, stood like ancient sentinels, their upper reaches already dusted with early snow. You pulled your wool traveling cloak tighter around your shoulders, feeling the altitude in every breath. The thin mountain air was something you would need to adjust to, especially given the physical demands of your profession. Conducting séances was far more exhausting than most people realized. The mental concentration required to maintain a trance state, the physical manifestations that often accompanied spirit communication, and the emotional weight of channeling messages from the other side all took their toll. Your fingers unconsciously went to the cameo brooch at your throat, a gift from your mentor, Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, who had introduced you to the world of spiritualism 12 years prior. She had recognized your natural sensitivity to the spirit realm, that peculiar combination of empathy, intuition, and what she called the sight, an ability to perceive what others could not. Under her tutelage, you had learned not just the genuine aspects of mediumship, but also the theatrical elements that helped skeptics become believers, and believers become devoted clients. The train whistle announced your arrival at Georgetown Station, its piercing call echoing off the mountain walls. Through the window, you could see a small gathering of people on the platform, dressed in their finest clothing despite the dust that seemed to coat everything in these mining towns. Among them stood a distinguished gentleman in a black suit and top hat, holding a sign that read simply Madame Marguerite. You gathered your traveling bag, checking that your most essential tools were secure, your personal crystal sphere wrapped in black velvet, a set of slate boards for spirit writing, and a leather journal where you recorded your observations and experiences. The heavier equipment in your trunk would be retrieved later, the spirit cabinet, the larger crystals, the brass trumpets for voice manifestations, and the various other implements that transformed an ordinary room into a gateway between worlds. Stepping onto the platform, you were immediately struck by how different the air felt here, crisp, thin, carrying the scent of pine and the faint metallic tang that you would learn came from the silver smelters that operated day and night. The gentleman with the sign approached, removing his hat with a flourish. "Madame Marguerite, I presume?" "I am Dr. Harrison Clark, president of the Georgetown Spiritualist Society. We are so pleased you've accepted our invitation." Dr. Clark was a man in his 50s, with silver hair that matched the town's primary export and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His handshake was firm but gentle, the hands of a physician who had likely seen too much death in these harsh mountains and sought comfort in the possibility of continuation beyond the grave. "The pleasure is mine, Dr. Clark," you replied, allowing a slight French accent to color your words, an affectation that Madame Thornton had taught you added an air of continental sophistication. "I sense this place has great spiritual energy. The veil is thin here, yes?" "Indeed, madam. Perhaps it's the altitude, or perhaps it's the number of souls who have passed through our town on their journey to the other side. The mountains have claimed many lives, mining accidents, avalanches, the harsh winters. There is much sorrow here, but also much hope." As he spoke, other members of the welcoming committee introduced themselves. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, wife of a mine owner, draped in black silk and mourning jewelry; Mr. James Crawford, a banker whose refined manners couldn't quite hide the calculating look in his eyes as he assessed whether you were worth the investment; and Miss Catherine Murphy, a young woman who ran the local bookshop and whose eyes held the eager light of a true believer. "We've arranged for you to stay at the Hotel de Paris," Dr. Clark explained as a porter loaded your trunk onto a small wagon. "Monsieur Dupuy, the proprietor, has prepared his finest suite for you. Tomorrow, once you've rested, we'll show you the space we've secured for your séances. It's in the Masonic Hall, a private room that can accommodate up to 12 participants." The walk from the station to the hotel was brief but illuminating. Georgetown's main street was a testament to the wealth that silver had brought. Brick buildings stood alongside wooden structures, with businesses ranging from practical hardware stores, assay offices, groceries, to refined, a millinery shop, a photographer's studio, even an opera house. The wooden sidewalks kept pedestrians above the muddy street, where horses and wagons created a constant flow of traffic. Men in rough mining clothes walked alongside ladies in bustled dresses, creating a unique social mixture. You noticed how many people wore black or had black armbands. Death was a constant companion in mining towns, and the outward signs of mourning were everywhere. This observation both saddened you and confirmed that you would find plenty of work here. The Hotel de Paris stood out among its neighbors, a two-story brick building with elegant French touches that seemed almost absurd in this rough mountain setting. Yet as you entered the lobby, you understood that this was a deliberate creation of civilization in the wilderness. Persian rugs covered polished wooden floors, gas lamps cast a warm glow over burgundy wallpaper, and the scent of French cooking wafted from the dining room. Monsieur Louis Dupuy himself greeted you, a diminutive Frenchman with waxed mustache and impeccable manners. "Madame Marguerite, bienvenue. Your reputation precedes you. I have prepared our rose room for your stay. It has the best light and the most privacy. I understand that one in your profession requires tranquility for proper communion with the spirits, non?" Your room was indeed lovely, with rose-patterned wallpaper, a brass bed with a thick feather mattress, and a writing desk positioned near a window that looked out over the town and up to the mountains beyond. Your trunk had already been delivered, sitting at the foot of the bed like a treasure chest of mysteries. As you unpacked your equipment, handling each item with the reverence it deserved, you considered the work ahead. Each tool had its purpose in the séance room. The crystal spheres served as focal points for concentration, their surfaces perfect for scrying, the practice of perceiving visions within their depths. The slate boards, when placed beneath the table, would sometimes bear messages from spirits, words appearing as if written by invisible hands. The brass trumpets, when conditions were right, could amplify spirit voices, allowing them to speak directly to the living. But your most important tools were intangible: your sensitivity to emotional currents, your ability to read the subtle cues that revealed what people most needed to hear, and your genuine gift for providing comfort to the grieving. For while skeptics might debate the reality of spirit communication, there was no denying the healing that could come from a well-conducted séance, the peace that settled over a mourning parent who received a message from their departed child, or the closure a widow found in a final conversation with her husband. That first evening, you dined alone in your room, requesting a simple meal of soup and bread. The altitude made you lightheaded, and you knew from experience that it was important to acclimate slowly. As you ate, you studied the notes Dr. Clark had left for you, a list of potential clients, brief histories of recent deaths in the community, and information about the Spiritualist Society members. The work of a séance leader in a place like Georgetown would be different from your practice in Chicago. There, you had dealt mainly with established families, people of steady means and refined sensibilities. Here, your clients would include rough miners seeking contact with friends killed in cave-ins, immigrant families trying to connect with relatives left behind in distant countries, and prostitutes from the row of cribs along Brownell Street mourning colleagues who had met violent ends. Each would require a different approach. The miners would respect directness and might be more accepting of physical manifestations, table rappings, levitations, and the like. The society ladies would expect more refined communications, perhaps automatic writing or trance speaking. The working girls would need compassion without judgment, understanding without condescension. As darkness fell over Georgetown, you prepared for bed with your usual ritual. First, you cleansed your crystals with sage smoke, a practice learned from a Lakota woman you had met during a brief stay in Dakota Territory. Then, you spent 30 minutes in meditation, clearing your mind and opening your consciousness to any spirits who might wish to make their presence known. The room grew cold, colder than could be explained by the mountain altitude alone. You felt the familiar tingling at the base of your skull that indicated a spiritual presence. Opening your eyes slowly, you saw a faint shimmer near the window, the suggestion of a figure. A man, you sensed, middle-aged, wearing the rough clothes of a miner. There was sadness around him, but also urgency. Tomorrow, you whispered to the presence. I'm not yet established here. Tomorrow I will create a proper space for communication. The figure faded, but you knew this was just the beginning. Georgetown was full of restless spirits, souls with unfinished business, messages undelivered. Your work here would be plentiful and important. The next morning arrived with brilliant sunshine streaming through your window, the light at this altitude possessing a clarity that seemed almost supernatural. After a breakfast of fresh eggs, sourdough bread, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead, a phrase that made you smile given your profession, Dr. Clark arrived to escort you to the Masonic Hall. The walk through Georgetown streets in daylight revealed details you had missed the evening before. Every other building seemed to house a saloon, their doors already open despite the early hour, piano music and rough laughter spilling onto the street. The contrast with the church steeples rising above the commercial buildings spoke to the dual nature of mining towns, sin and salvation existing side by side, often competing for the same souls. We lose about 3 men a month in the mines, Dr. Clark explained as you walked, his voice taking on the clinical detachment of a physician discussing mortality statistics. Cave-ins, explosions, bad air, the mountain demands its tribute for the silver it yields. Then there are the avalanches in winter, the accidents with machinery, the violence that erupts in the saloons. Death is our constant companion here. And yet people continue to come, you observed, stepping carefully over a muddy patch where the wooden sidewalk had broken. The silver fever, madam. Men will risk everything for the chance at wealth. And where the men go, civilization follows, families, businesses, culture. We even have an opera house now, though it doubles as a dance hall on weekends. The Masonic Hall was an impressive 3-story brick building, one of the most substantial structures in town. Dr. Clark led you through a side entrance and up a narrow staircase to the second floor. At the end of a dimly lit hallway, he produced a key and opened a heavy wooden door. The room beyond was perfect for your purposes. About 20 feet square, with high ceilings and tall windows covered by thick burgundy drapes that could block out all light when drawn. The walls were painted a deep green, and gas lamps and ornate fixtures provided adjustable lighting. A round table sat in the center, surrounded by 12 chairs with cushioned seats. The Masons use this for certain ceremonies, Dr. Clark explained, but they've agreed to let us have it 3 evenings a week, plus Sunday afternoons. Will this suit your needs? You walked slowly around the room, running your hands along the walls, feeling for energy currents. There was power here, old power, the kind that came from repeated ritual and focused intention. The Masons, with their ancient ceremonies and sacred geometry, had inadvertently created an excellent conductor for spiritual energy. It will do very well, you said, already envisioning how you would arrange your equipment. I'll need to cleanse the space properly, of course, and make some adjustments to optimize the spiritual conductivity. The spirit cabinet should go here, in the northeast corner. That's the traditional direction for communication with the other side. The table is well positioned, though I'll need to treat it with special oils to enhance its receptivity. Over the next several hours, you work to transform the room into a proper séance chamber. From your trunk, you unpacked yards of black fabric that would be hung to create a cabinet in the corner, a small, enclosed space where you could sit when attempting the most difficult manifestations. The cabinet helped concentrate spiritual energy and provided the darkness that spirits seem to prefer for physical manifestations. You arranged your crystals on a shelf, each one chosen for specific properties. Clear quartz for amplification of psychic energy, amethyst for spiritual protection, obsidian for grounding. The brass trumpets were placed on stands at various points around the room, their mouths pointed toward the center table. These would serve as conduits for spirit voices, though you knew that achieving audible voice phenomena required ideal conditions that were rare. The slate boards required special preparation. You cleaned them thoroughly with a solution of vinegar and salt water, then charged them in the sunlight streaming through the windows. These boards, when placed beneath the table or held by participants, could receive direct writing from spirits, messages that would appear without any visible hand creating them. Of course, there were ways to facilitate such messages when the spirits were reluctant to communicate, techniques involving special chalks and hidden mechanisms that you had learned from Madame Thornton. But you used these methods sparingly and only when absolutely necessary to maintain faith in those who desperately needed it. As you worked, you became aware of being watched. Turning, you saw Miss Catherine Murphy standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fascination. "Forgive me for intruding," she said quickly. "Dr. Clark said I might observe, if you didn't mind. I've read so much about spiritualism, but I've never seen a medium prepare their space before." You smiled warmly. Enthusiastic believers like Miss Murphy were valuable allies in establishing a practice. They spread word of successful séances and helped create the atmosphere of faith that made spirit communication more likely. "Come in, my dear. There's much to learn about creating the proper conditions for spiritual manifestation. The spirits are all around us always, but making them able to communicate requires careful preparation." You spent the next hour educating Miss Murphy about your tools and techniques. You explained how the placement of furniture could create or disrupt energy flows, how certain scents, lavender for calm, sage for cleansing, frankincense for elevation of consciousness, affected the vibrational frequency of a space. You demonstrated the proper way to hold hands during a séance to create an unbroken circuit of energy, and how breathing exercises could help participants enter the receptive state necessary for spirit communication. The most important thing, you explained, arranging chairs around the table, is that participants come with open hearts and minds. Skepticism creates a barrier that spirits find difficult to penetrate. But blind faith is equally problematic. It makes people susceptible to false messages and can attract negative entities. The ideal is respectful openness, a willingness to receive combined with discernment about what comes through. Miss Murphy took notes in a small leather journal, her pen scratching quickly across the pages. "How did you discover your gift, madam? Were you born with it?" This was a question you had answered many times, and you had developed a response that was mostly truthful while maintaining the necessary mystique. "I showed sensitivity from childhood. I could sense when someone was ill before symptoms appeared, knew when deaths would occur in our neighborhood. But it wasn't until I met my mentor, Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, that I understood these experiences were connections with the spirit realm. She taught me to channel these abilities, to serve as a bridge between worlds." And the physical toll, Miss Murphy asked hesitantly. "I've read that mediums often suffer exhaustion, even illness, from their work." You nodded gravely. This was an important aspect of the profession that helped justify the fees you charged. "Each séance draws upon my vital energies. When I enter a trance state, my own spirit partially leaves my body to make room for communicating entities. This is why I can only conduct 3 or 4 séances per week at most. More than that, and I risk permanent damage to my psychic abilities, or worse, leaving myself vulnerable to possession by malevolent spirits." The young woman's eyes widened at this last statement, and you could see her newfound respect for the dangers you faced on behalf of others. That afternoon, you conducted your first informal séance in Georgetown, with just Dr. Clark, Miss Murphy, and Mrs. Ashford in attendance. It was what you called a testing séance, an opportunity to gauge the spiritual atmosphere of a new location and understand the needs of your core supporters. The 4 of you sat around the table as you dimmed the gas lamps to create a twilight atmosphere. You led them through the preparatory breathing exercises, then joined hands to form the sacred circle. "Spirits of Georgetown," you intoned, allowing your voice to drop to a lower, more resonant register, "we open ourselves to your presence. We seek communion with those who have passed beyond the veil. If any soul wishes to communicate, we invite you to make yourself known." The room grew cold, a genuine drop in temperature that you had learned to recognize as authentic spiritual presence. The table beneath your joined hands began to vibrate slightly, then more pronounced. Mrs. Ashford gasped. "Is someone there?" you asked the darkness. "If you wish to communicate, rap once for yes, twice for no." A single, clear knock sounded from somewhere within the table itself. Even you were slightly surprised by the clarity of the response. Georgetown spirits were indeed eager to communicate. "Will you spell out your name for us?" "I will recite the alphabet, and you may knock when I reach the correct letter." This was a tedious but effective method of spirit communication, one that required patience from all involved. Slowly, letter by letter, a name emerged: Thomas. Mrs. Ashford's intake of breath was sharp. "Thomas was my husband's partner in the Pelican mine. He died in a cave-in last spring. Thomas, do you have a message for someone here?" The table rapped once. "Is it for Mrs. Ashford?" Again, a single rap. Through the alphabet method, a message slowly emerged: "Tell Henry northeast shaft unstable." Mrs. Ashford went pale. "Henry is my husband. The northeast shaft, they're planning to expand it next week." This was the kind of specific, useful information that built a medium's reputation quickly. Whether the warning came from the spirit of Thomas or from your own subconscious processing of overheard conversations and subtle cues, the effect was the same: lives might be saved, and your value to the community was established. The séance continued for another 30 minutes, with 2 more spirits making contact: a young woman who had died in childbirth and wanted her sister to know she was at peace, and a minor who insisted his death was not an accident as reported. You carefully noted each communication in your journal, knowing that verification of these messages would be crucial to building your practice. When you finally broke the circle and raised the lights, all 3 participants looked drained but exhilarated. Mrs. Ashford was already planning to send word to her husband about the northeast shaft. Miss Murphy was practically vibrating with excitement about the successful communication. And Dr. Clark was nodding thoughtfully, his scientific mind clearly trying to reconcile what he had witnessed with his medical training. "Remarkable," he said simply. "Quite remarkable. I believe, Madame Marguerite, that you will find Georgetown most receptive to your work." Within 2 weeks of your arrival in Georgetown, you had established a regular schedule and pricing structure that reflected both the economic realities of a mining town and the value of your unique services. The business side of mediumship was something rarely discussed in spiritualist literature, but it was essential for survival, especially in a place where the cost of living was inflated by the remote location and the constant influx of fortune seekers. Your fee structure was carefully calibrated. Private séances for wealthy families commanded the highest price, $20 for a 2-hour session, equivalent to what a miner might earn in a week. These exclusive sessions were held in private homes, usually for families dealing with recent bereavement. Group séances at the Masonic Hall were more affordable at $3 per person, making them accessible to the middle class, shopkeepers, clerks, skilled craftsmen. Once a month, you held what you called a public circle for a donation of any amount, ensuring that even the poorest residents could seek comfort from the spirit world. Dr. Clark served as your business manager, handling bookings and payments so you could maintain the ethereal detachment expected of a medium. He kept detailed records in a leather-bound ledger, noting not just financial transactions but also the names of spirits contacted and messages received. This documentation would prove valuable for building credibility when messages were later verified. On a typical working day, you might conduct a private morning session, rest in the afternoon, then lead a group séance in the evening. The physical and mental demands were considerable. Each séance required intense concentration, the ability to enter and maintain a trance state, and the emotional fortitude to channel sometimes disturbing messages from the other side. Your toolkit had expanded since arriving in Georgetown. The high altitude and dry air created excellent conditions for certain phenomena. Table levitations seemed easier to achieve, and the electronic properties of the quartz-rich mountains appeared to enhance spirit communication. You had also acquired local materials, crystals from nearby mines that seemed to pulse with their own energy, and sage gathered from the mountain slopes that produced a particularly purifying smoke. The spirit cabinet you had constructed in the Masonic Hall had become a focal point of your more dramatic séances. When you entered the cabinet and fell into a deep trance, phenomena would occur that amazed even skeptical observers. Musical instruments would play untouched, objects would move across the room, and occasionally, a pale, luminous form would emerge from the cabinet, what spiritualists called a full materialization. These materializations required careful preparation. The special luminous paint you had brought from Chicago, made from phosphorescent minerals, could create convincing spirit forms when applied to lightweight fabric. But you used such theatrical effects sparingly, and only when you sensed that the audience needed dramatic proof to maintain their faith. More often, you relied on genuine intuition and psychological insight to provide messages that resonated with truth. Your typical working week might look like this. Monday mornings were reserved for private consultations at the Hôtel de Paris. These were not full séances but rather advisory sessions where clients could discuss their spiritual concerns and receive guidance. You charged $5 for these hour-long meetings, during which you might read palms, consult tarot cards, or simply listen with the deep attention that many people craved but rarely received. Tuesday and Thursday evenings were group séances at the Masonic Hall. These sessions, limited to 12 participants, had become so popular that Dr. Clark maintained a waiting list. The groups were carefully composed, mixing believers with skeptics, ensuring a balance of energies that created the optimal conditions for spirit manifestation. Saturday afternoons you reserved for what you called development circles, training sessions for those who showed mediumistic abilities. Several Georgetown residents had latent psychic talents, and you worked with them to develop these gifts. This not only created a network of allies who could attest to your legitimacy but also genuinely helped people understand and control abilities that might otherwise disturb them. Sundays were complex. Morning church services were attended by most of the town's respectable citizens, and you had learned it was politic to make an appearance at least once a month, rotating between the Methodist, Presbyterian, and Catholic churches to avoid showing favoritism. Sunday afternoons, however, were when you held your most experimental séances, working with the inner circle of the Spiritualist Society to attempt more challenging communications. The physical toll of this schedule was significant. Each trance state depleted your energy reserves, leaving you exhausted and vulnerable. You experienced frequent headaches, particularly after intense materializations. Your appetite fluctuated wildly. Sometimes you were ravenous after a séance, needing to consume large quantities of food to restore your strength. Other times, you could barely tolerate even the lightest meal. The high altitude compounded these effects. Your first month in Georgetown, you experienced altitude sickness symptoms that mimicked the exhaustion from spiritual work, shortness of breath, dizziness, insomnia. You learned to pace yourself, taking frequent rests and staying well hydrated with the mineral-rich spring water that flowed from the mountains. Your earnings, while substantial by Georgetown standards, were offset by significant expenses. Your wardrobe alone was a considerable investment. As Madame Marguerite, you needed to maintain an appearance that balanced otherworldly mystique with respectable propriety. Your working clothes consisted of flowing silk dresses in deep purples and blacks, adorned with jet beads and silver symbols. Each outfit cost nearly as much as a miner's monthly wage, but the visual impact was essential to your authority. Then there were the ongoing costs of supplies. Candles infused with essential oils, specially prepared incense, replacement crystals when energies became too turbulent and caused fractures, and the various chemicals and materials needed for more elaborate manifestations. You also maintained subscriptions to spiritualist publications from around the world, keeping current with new techniques and theories in the field. Your room at the Hotel de Paris cost $40 per month, a premium rate that included meals and maid service. While this seemed extravagant, the prestige of the address added to your credibility, and Monsieur Dupuy's discretion about your unusual visitors and late-night activities was invaluable. Despite the expenses, you were able to save a considerable sum. In your first 3 months in Georgetown, you had put aside nearly $300, carefully hidden in a specially constructed false bottom in your trunk. This emergency fund was essential. Mediums who lost their abilities due to exhaustion, scandal, or shifting public opinion could find themselves destitute quickly. The economic ecosystem of Georgetown's spiritual community extended beyond your direct earnings. Your presence had stimulated related businesses. The local bookshop reported increased sales of spiritualist literature. A photographer had begun offering spirit photography sessions, claiming to capture images of ghosts on his photographic plates. An enterprising woman had opened a shop selling crystals, herbs, and other metaphysical supplies, sourcing many items from the indigenous peoples who knew the mountain's secret places. It was a raw November morning when Mrs. Bridget O'Sullivan first came to see you. Snow had been falling steadily for 2 days, blanketing Georgetown in a pristine white that temporarily hid the mine tailings and mud that usually marked the landscape. She arrived at your consulting room in the Hotel de Paris dressed entirely in black, her rough hands and careworn face marking her as one of the working-class women who took in laundry or cleaning to survive after losing their husbands to the mines. "Madam," she began, her Irish accent thick with emotion, "I've saved for 3 months to afford your fee. My Patrick, he passed in the terrible mine collapse last August. I need to know he's at peace." You guided her to a chair near the window, noting how she clutched a small tin locket, likely containing a photograph or lock of hair from her deceased husband. These personal items often served as powerful conduits for spirit communication. "Tell me about Patrick," you said gently, pouring her a cup of tea from the service Monsieur Dupuis had provided. The simple act of being served often helped working-class clients relax in the unfamiliar elegance of your consulting room. As she spoke, you learned their story. Patrick O'Sullivan had come from County Cork 5 years ago, sending for Bridget and their 3 children once he'd saved enough from his work in the mines. They'd been building a life here, saving to buy a small plot of land where they could farm rather than risk the dangerous underground work. Then came the morning when Patrick's crew entered the terrible mine's lower levels, and a support beam, weakened by water seepage, gave way. 17 men died that day, Bridget whispered, her tea growing cold in her hands. They brought up some bodies, but Patrick's still down there. The company sealed that section, said it was too dangerous to retrieve the rest. This detail was significant. In your experience, spirits of those whose bodies remained unrecovered were often particularly restless, unable to fully transition to the other side. It might make communication easier, though potentially more emotionally intense. You moved to your séance table, a smaller, more intimate version than the one at the Masonic Hall. "Would you place Patrick's locket on the table, please? And join hands with me." The moment the circle was formed, you felt it, a presence so strong it made you gasp. The room temperature plummeted, and your breath became visible in small puffs of vapor. This was not theatrical effect but genuine spiritual manifestation, the kind that reminded you that whatever skeptics might say, there were indeed forces beyond the material world. "Patrick O'Sullivan," you intoned, "your beloved Bridget seeks communion with you. If you are present, make yourself known." The response was immediate. 3 loud knocks resonated from within the table, the traditional spiritualist sign for "I am here." Bridget's hands trembled in yours, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Through a combination of table rapping, automatic writing, your hand moving across paper without conscious control, and direct voice mediumship, Patrick's message emerged. He spoke of his love for his family, described the moment of the collapse, sudden, without pain, and most remarkably, provided specific information about a hidden cache of money he'd saved without telling Bridget, $20 wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under their bed. "He was always doing that," Bridget sobbed, half laughing through her tears. "Hiding little surprises for us." But then the communication took a darker turn. Patrick's spirit expressed anguish about being trapped underground, unable to rest properly without proper burial. He pleaded for Bridget to convince the mining company to recover the bodies, warning that until they did, the terrible mine would remain cursed, dangerous to any who entered. This presented you with an ethical dilemma. Encouraging Bridget to campaign for body recovery could put her in conflict with powerful mining interests. Yet the message felt genuine, urgent in a way that suggested real danger. After the séance ended and Bridget left, clutching a paper with Patrick's messages, you sat in contemplation. These were the moments that defined the true responsibility of a medium, when the messages received could have real-world consequences beyond personal comfort. You decided to take action. That afternoon, you visited Dr. Clark and shared your concerns about the terrible mine, framing it as a spiritual warning that shouldn't be ignored. Dr. Clark, while personally sympathetic, explained the economic realities. The Terrible Mine is one of the most productive in the district. The company has already written off that section and the lost men. They've paid minimal death benefits to the families and consider the matter closed. Pressing them to reopen that dangerous area for body recovery, it would be costly and risky. And if more men die because the spirits are disturbed, you asked. What cost then? It was Mrs. Ashford who provided an unexpected solution. Her husband, influenced by the warning about the northeast shaft that had proved accurate, an inspection had indeed revealed dangerous instability, had become more receptive to spiritual guidance. When she heard about Patrick O'Sullivan's message, she convinced her husband to use his influence with the mining company board. The negotiation took weeks, but eventually, a compromise was reached. The company would attempt recovery of the bodies, but only if the families contributed to the cost and signed waivers absolving the company of liability. It was harsh, even cruel, but it was something. You organized a benefit séance, with all proceeds going to the recovery fund. The event, held in the Opera House to accommodate the crowd, raised over $500. During the séance, multiple spirits of the trapped miners manifested, their combined presence so powerful that several attendees fainted, and mysterious lights were seen floating above the stage. When the bodies were finally recovered in December, something remarkable happened. The section of the mine that had been experiencing frequent accidents and equipment failures suddenly stabilized. Miners reported that the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the terrible mine lifted. Production increased, and there were no serious accidents for the remainder of the winter. Bridget O'Sullivan became one of your most devoted supporters, though she could rarely afford your services. You often waived your fees for her, conducting brief communications with Patrick who, now properly buried in the Georgetown cemetery, seemed at peace. She repaid this kindness by becoming your unofficial assistant, helping prepare the séance room and sharing her story with skeptics who doubted your abilities. The Terrible Mine incident established your reputation not just as a comfort to the grieving but as someone whose work had practical value for the living. Mining companies, while publicly dismissive of spiritualism, began quietly consulting you about the feel of new dig sites. You developed a secondary practice of what you called spiritual surveying, visiting mines to assess whether the spiritual atmosphere was conducive to safe operations. This work was particularly hazardous. The mines were dangerous enough without adding the complexity of spiritual investigation. You would descend into the dark tunnels, your lamp casting dancing shadows on rough-hewn walls, feeling for the presence of trapped spirits or negative energies. The combination of physical danger and psychic sensitivity left you exhausted for days afterward. December brought fierce winter to Georgetown, with snow piling higher than the first-floor windows and temperatures plunging to levels that made even hardened mountain folk huddle near their stoves. The approaching winter solstice, you explained to your circle, was a particularly powerful time for spirit communication, the longest night of the year when the veil between worlds grew tissue-thin. You had planned something special for the solstice séance, something that would demonstrate the full range of your mediumistic abilities. The preparations took weeks. You commissioned a local carpenter to modify your spirit cabinet, adding hidden panels that could be opened silently and installing small shelves to hold various manifestation aids. The interior was lined with black velvet that seemed to swallow light, creating a void that unnerved even those who knew it was empty. The cabinet work was precise and demanding. Each panel had to move soundlessly on specially oiled hinges, and the secret compartments had to be completely invisible even under close inspection. You paid the carpenter, a discreet German immigrant named Mueller, triple his usual rate for both his craftsmanship and his silence. Meanwhile, you prepared yourself physically and mentally for what would be the most demanding séance of your career in Georgetown. You fasted for 3 days before the solstice, consuming only water and light broths to purify your system. You meditated for hours each day, pushing your consciousness to the edges of the material world, establishing connections with the spirit realm that would facilitate communication. The guest list for the solstice séance was carefully curated. Along with your core supporters, Dr. Clark, Mrs. Ashford, Miss Murphy, you included Thomas Beaumont, the skeptical editor of the Georgetown Courier who had written dismissive articles about spiritualism, Margaret Chen, the Chinese herbalist whose own culture had different but parallel beliefs about spirit communication, and surprisingly, Father Miguel Santos from the Catholic Church, who attended in what he called an unofficial capacity to better understand what drew his parishioners to your sessions. On the night of December 21st, the séance room in the Masonic Hall was transformed. You had arranged dozens of candles in specific patterns based on sacred geometry, their flickering light creating an atmosphere of ancient mystery. The spirit cabinet stood in its corner like a doorway to another dimension, its dark interior seeming to pulse with potential energy. The participants arrived bundled against the cold, their breaths still visible even in the heated room. You greeted each personally, touching their hands to gauge their emotional state and receptivity. Thomas Beaumont's skepticism radiated from him like a shield, but beneath it, you sensed curiosity and perhaps a hope that his doubts would be proven wrong. Margaret Chen brought her own spiritual energy, different from the Western tradition but compatible with it. Father Santos maintained a careful neutrality, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Tonight, you began once everyone was seated. We attempt something rarely achieved, a full materialization of a spirit form. This is the most difficult and dangerous form of mediumship, requiring me to donate a substantial portion of my own life force to give the spirit temporary physical substance. I must warn you all, do not break the circle no matter what you witness. Do not touch any manifestation that appears. And if I call for light, someone must immediately raise the gas lamps to full brightness. You enter the spirit cabinet, settling onto the small seat within. The cabinet door was closed but not locked, an important detail that allowed skeptics to know you could be checked at any moment. You began the deep breathing that would induce the trance state, feeling your consciousness separate from your physical form like smoke rising from a snuffed candle. What happened next would be debated in Georgetown for years to come. According to the witnesses, within minutes of your entering the cabinet, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. Frost formed on the windows despite the stove burning hotly in the corner. Then came the sounds, first, a low humming that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps walking around the outside of the circle. A pale, luminous mist began to seep from beneath the cabinet door. It pooled on the floor, then slowly rose, taking shape. The figure that emerged was that of a young woman in a flowing white gown, her features indistinct but clearly visible. She moved around the circle, pausing before each participant. When she reached Thomas Beaumont, she spoke in a voice that witnesses described as both ethereal and deeply sad. "Thomas, your sister Emma forgives you. The argument before she died, she wants you to know she understood why you couldn't lend the money. Her love transcends death." Beaumont, the hardened skeptic, broke down sobbing. His sister had died of consumption 2 years ago, shortly after he'd refused to lend her money for an experimental treatment in Denver, believing it to be quackery. The manifestation continued to each participant, delivering messages that were startlingly specific and emotionally powerful. To Margaret Chen, she spoke in Cantonese about her grandmother's recipes, providing the missing ingredient to a healing tonic that had been incomplete since her grandmother's death. To Father Santos, she delivered a message in Latin from his mentor in Mexico City, using theological phrases that you couldn't possibly have known. Then something unexpected occurred. A second figure began to materialize, a man in miner's clothing, his face blackened with coal dust. He didn't speak but pointed urgently at the floor, tracing letters with his finger in the air, CAVEINTOMORROWSILVRPLUME. Before anyone could respond, you screamed from within the cabinet. Dr. Clark immediately raised the lights to reveal you collapsed on the cabinet floor, blood trickling from your nose, your skin pale as parchment. He rushed to your aid, checking your pulse, which he later reported was barely detectable. It took nearly an hour to revive you fully, during which time the assembled group debated what they had witnessed. Even Beaumont, shaken by the message from his sister, couldn't deny the reality of what had occurred. Father Santos crossed himself repeatedly, muttering prayers in Spanish. The warning about the silver plume mine proved prophetic. The next day, despite attempts to warn the workers, a major cave-in occurred exactly as predicted. Miraculously, because the warning had spread through the mining community, the usually crowded section was nearly empty, and only 3 men were injured rather than the dozens who would typically have been present. The physical cost to you was severe. You were bedridden for a week following the solstice séance, unable to keep food down, plagued by nightmares where you felt trapped between worlds. Dr. Clark attended you daily, documenting symptoms that he couldn't explain medically, your body temperature fluctuating wildly, your heartbeat occasionally stopping for several seconds before resuming, and strange marks appearing on your skin that looked like writing in an unknown alphabet. Miss Murphy and Bridget O'Sullivan took turns nursing you, bringing broths and teas, reading to you from spiritualist texts and the Bible alike. During your recovery, you experienced what you later described as uncontrolled mediumship, spirits attempting to communicate through you without formal séance conditions. You would speak in voices not your own, write messages in languages you didn't know, and occasionally, small objects in the room would move without anyone touching them. As winter deepened in Georgetown, you took time during your recovery to reflect on and refine the tools and techniques that made your work possible. Each implement in your collection served both practical and symbolic purposes, and understanding their proper use was essential for any serious medium. Your primary crystal sphere, imported from Brazil, was perhaps your most valuable tool. The quartz had been mined from a cave system that local indigenous peoples considered sacred, and it contained internal fractures that created rainbow effects when light passed through at certain angles. During scrying sessions, you would gaze into its depths, allowing your vision to unfocus until images began to form in the crystal's inner landscape. Clients were often amazed when you described scenes from their past or present circumstances that you couldn't have known through normal means. The care of this crystal was intensive. Every night, you would cleanse it with spring water blessed under the full moon, then wrap it in black silk to protect it from negative energies. Once a month, you would feed the crystal by leaving it in direct sunlight for exactly 3 hours, allowing it to absorb solar energy that enhanced its divinatory properties. Your collection of brass-speaking trumpets served a different purpose. These cone-shaped instruments, ranging from 12 inches to 3 feet in length, were designed to amplify spirit voices. During séances, they would be placed on the table or sometimes levitate in the air, and voices would emerge from them, sometimes whispers, occasionally clear words, and rarely, full sentences. The brass construction was crucial. You had learned that spirits found it easier to manipulate the vibrations in brass than in other metals. The maintenance of these trumpets required regular polishing with a special solution of vinegar, salt, and crushed sage. The interior had to be kept perfectly smooth, as any imperfection could distort spirit communications. You had also discovered that tuning the trumpets by striking them gently with a silver spoon before each séance seemed to enhance their receptivity. Your slate boards for automatic writing were perhaps the most convincing tools for skeptics. These consisted of 2 school slates bound together with a small piece of chalk between them. When sealed and placed under the table or held by participants, messages would appear on the inner surfaces, often in handwriting recognized as belonging to deceased individuals. The genuine phenomenon of automatic writing did occur, though rarely. More often, you employed a technique taught by Madame Thornton involving specially prepared chalk that would slowly materialize writing through chemical reaction when exposed to heat from hands holding the slates. The messages, however, were always genuinely inspired by your intuitive reading of the client's needs and desires. Your collection of essential oils and incenses served multiple purposes. Lavender oil, applied to pulse points, helped nervous clients relax and enter a receptive state. Frankincense, burned in a brass censer, elevated the spiritual atmosphere and masked any telltale sounds from mechanical séance effects. Sage, both burned and infused in water for cleansing, protected against negative entities that might be attracted to the psychic energy generated during séances. You had learned to blend your own special incense, combining frankincense, myrrh, sandalwood, and a secret ingredient, a resin from pine trees struck by lightning, which local Native Americans had taught you to harvest. This blend, which you called spirit's breath, created a smoke that seemed to make the veil between worlds more permeable. The spirit cabinet itself was a masterwork of engineering disguised as simple furniture. Standing 6 feet tall and 3 feet square, it appeared to be nothing more than a wooden cabinet painted black. However, Mueller's craftsmanship had created a tool capable of producing remarkable effects. Hidden within the walls were speaking tubes that could carry whispers from the cabinet to various points in the room, creating the illusion of spirits moving through space. A series of small mirrors, positioned at precise angles, could reflect light in ways that created the appearance of glowing forms. Most ingeniously, a false back panel could be silently opened, allowing for costume changes or the introduction of props during the séance while you appeared to remain entranced within the cabinet. Your wardrobe was as much a tool as any crystal or trumpet. For regular séances, you wore flowing robes of deep purple or black silk, embroidered with silver thread in patterns that drew from various mystical traditions, Celtic knots, Egyptian ankhs, Sanskrit characters. The movement of these robes in candlelight created an otherworldly effect that immediately set you apart from the mundane world. For private consultations, you dressed more conservatively but with careful attention to detail. A black wool dress with jet buttons, a cameo brooch containing a lock of hair from your supposed spirit guide, actually your own hair, specially treated, and always, a silver chain holding a crystal pendulum that you could use for quick divination when needed. Your jewelry served practical purposes beyond adornment. Rings with hidden compartments could hold small amounts of phosphorescent powder for creating spirit lights. A bracelet with small bells would chime at crucial moments, suggesting spiritual presence. A locket contained a tiny mirror that allowed you to see behind you while appearing to be in trance. The furniture in your séance room was chosen with equal care. The round table, made of oak with an ebony inlay of a pentagram, had a hollow pedestal through which a confederate could extend rods to create rapping sounds or cause the table to tilt and levitate. Of course, you rarely used such crude methods, preferring to rely on genuine phenomena when possible and subtle psychological techniques when not. The chairs were specially selected for their acoustic properties. When shifted slightly, they would create creaking sounds that suggested spiritual presence. The cushions contained herbs that released subtle, calming scents when compressed by sitting, unconsciously relaxing participants and making them more receptive to suggestion. Your library of spiritualist literature was both a resource and a prop. Volumes on everything from ancient Egyptian burial practices to modern scientific investigations of psychic phenomena lined your shelves. You studied these texts religiously, both to deepen your genuine understanding and to be able to quote authorities when skeptics challenged your methods. You also maintained detailed records of every séance, every client, and every spirit communication. These journals, written in a cipher of your own devising, contain not just the surface information but also your observations about family dynamics, hidden secrets revealed through careful observation, and patterns of grief and hope that helped you provide meaningful messages to those in need. The winter of 1884 brought an unexpected development to your practice in Georgetown. Margaret Chen, the Chinese herbalist who had attended your solstice séance, approached you with a proposition that would expand your understanding of spirit communication across cultural boundaries. Madame Marguerite, she said during a private meeting at her herb shop on Rose Street, my people have our own ways of speaking with ancestors. Perhaps we could learn from each other? Margaret's shop was a wonder of mysterious jars filled with dried roots, preserved insects, and mineral compounds labeled in Chinese characters. The air was thick with the scent of ginseng and other herbs you couldn't identify. Despite the exotic atmosphere, you felt immediately comfortable. The energy here was similar to your séance room, charged with intention and ancient wisdom. Margaret explained that the Chinese community in Georgetown, mostly men who worked the mines or ran laundries and restaurants, had their own spiritual needs that weren't being met. They couldn't return to China to tend ancestral graves, couldn't perform proper funeral rites when someone died far from home. The weight of these unperformed obligations created a spiritual burden that affected their daily lives. In our tradition, Margaret explained, pouring a tea that tasted of flowers and earth, the dead require specific offerings, incense, paper money, food. Without these, they become hungry ghosts, unable to rest, causing misfortune for the living. You found fascinating parallels between Chinese ancestor worship and Western spiritualism. Both recognize the continuation of consciousness after death, the ability of the dead to influence the living, and the importance of proper rituals to maintain harmony between worlds. Margaret proposed a partnership. She would teach you about Chinese spiritual practices, and you would help conduct séances for the Chinese community, bridging the gap between their traditional beliefs and the Western spiritualist methods that were more accepted in Georgetown society. Your first joint séance was held in the back room of Margaret's shop, with 5 Chinese miners in attendance. The language barrier was significant. Only Margaret and one of the miners spoke English fluently, but you discovered that spiritual communication transcended linguistic limitations. The preparation was different from your usual séances. Margaret created an altar with photographs of deceased relatives, burning incense in a bronze tripod, and setting out offerings of rice wine, oranges, and steamed buns. She explained that the food's essence would nourish the spirits, while the physical remains could be consumed by the living after the ceremony. You adapted your techniques to incorporate these elements. Instead of holding hands in a circle, participants held strings of jade beads that Margaret said would conduct spiritual energy. The speaking trumpet was replaced with a brass bell whose tone, Margaret explained, could be heard in both the physical and spirit worlds. When you entered your trance state, something remarkable happened. The spirits that came through spoke in Chinese, despite your complete ignorance of the language. Margaret translated, tears streaming down her face as messages emerged from fathers, mothers, and siblings left behind in Guangdong province. One particularly powerful communication came through for Wei Chen, no relation to Margaret, whose younger brother had died in a mine collapse the previous year. Through your mediumship, the brother's spirit spoke in rapid Cantonese, which Margaret translated. Elder brother, I am not angry that you brought me to this cold mountain. The gold we sought was less valuable than the bond between us. Tell our mother I died with her name on my lips. The money hidden in my mattress, send it home for sister's dowry. Wei Chen broke down completely, confirming details that you couldn't have known: the hidden money, his guilt over convincing his brother to come to America, his mother's specific worries about her daughter's marriage prospects. These Chinese séances became a regular part of your practice, usually held on Sunday mornings when the Christian churches were in session and the Chinese workers had their day off. The fee structure was different. Rather than individual payments, the Chinese community created a collective fund, contributing what they could afford. The physical toll of channeling in a language you didn't understand was extreme. After each Chinese séance, you would experience severe headaches and temporary aphasia, struggling to find words in English for hours afterward. Dr. Clark theorized that your brain was somehow processing linguistic patterns beyond your conscious understanding, creating a kind of psychic overload. Margaret began teaching you traditional Chinese medicine techniques to manage these effects. She introduced you to acupuncture, inserting hair-thin needles at specific points to restore what she called your qi flow. She prepared special herbal tonics that seemed to restore your energy more effectively than Western remedies. In exchange, you taught Margaret Western séance techniques. She proved to have natural mediumistic abilities, particularly in psychometry, the ability to receive impressions from objects. Give her a deceased person's possession, and she could describe their personality, their manner of death, sometimes even their final thoughts. This cross-cultural exchange enriched your practice immeasurably. You began incorporating elements of Chinese philosophy into your regular séances, the concept of yin and yang to explain the balance between physical and spirit worlds, the idea of ancestral influence on present circumstances, the importance of maintaining harmony between all elements of existence. The broader Georgetown community initially viewed these Chinese séances with suspicion. Some accused you of corrupting Christian spiritualism with pagan practices. Thomas Beaumont, despite his powerful experience at the Solstice Séance, wrote an editorial questioning whether Oriental mysticism was compatible with proper American spiritualism. You responded by holding a public demonstration that brought together both traditions. In the Opera House, before an audience of over 100 people, you and Margaret conducted a joint séance that contacted spirits from multiple cultural backgrounds. The evening culminated in a message from a Chinese miner to his Irish widow. They had married in secret, fearing persecution from both communities. The spirit spoke through you in accented English, providing details about hidden savings and expressing love that transcended cultural boundaries. The evening was a triumph, but it also attracted unwanted attention. A group calling itself the Georgetown Purification Society began distributing pamphlets denouncing you as a corrupting influence. They claimed you were practicing witchcraft, conducting unholy rituals, and undermining Christian values. The situation escalated when someone threw a rock through the window of Margaret's shop, with a note warning against celestial devil worship. The Chinese community, already marginalized, feared broader persecution. Several families stopped attending séances, worried about their safety. You faced a choice: curtail the Chinese séances to protect your mainstream practice, or stand by these sessions despite the risks. After deep meditation and consultation with your spirit guides, you chose to continue but with additional precautions. By February 1884, your reputation in Georgetown had solidified into something complex and contradictory. To believers, you were a gifted medium providing comfort and connection to the spirit world. To skeptics, you were at best a skilled performer, at worst a fraudulent predator preying on grief. The truth, as you well knew, lay somewhere between these extremes. The physical demands of your profession had become increasingly apparent. The altitude, combined with the intense energy expenditure of séances, had taken its toll. You had lost 15 pounds since arriving in Georgetown, your once robust constitution now fragile. Your hands, once steady, now trembled slightly when not engaged in spiritual work. Dark circles had become permanent fixtures beneath your eyes, which seemed to have gained an otherworldly luminosity, what Miss Murphy romantically called the gaze that pierces the veil. Your earnings, while substantial, came at this considerable cost. A detailed accounting of your finances revealed both the lucrative nature of spiritual work and its limitations. In a typical month, you might earn: private séances, 8 per month at $20 each, $160. Group séances, 12 per month, average 10 participants at $3 each, $360. Individual consultations, $20 per month at $5 each, $100. Special events and demonstrations, $50 to $100. Chinese community seances, collective payment $40. This totaled roughly $700 per month, an extraordinary sum when miners earned perhaps $75 monthly and shopkeepers might clear $100. However, your expenses were equally substantial. Hotel de Paris accommodation and meals, $40. Supplies, candles, incense, oils, replacement crystals, $50. Wardrobe maintenance and replacement, $75. Books and periodicals, $20. Medical consultations and remedies, $30. Charitable donations, expected of someone in your position, $50. Emergency fund savings, $200. Miscellaneous expenses, $35. This left you with approximately $200 monthly for personal use, still a comfortable sum but hardly the fortune that some imagined mediums accumulated. The medical consultations had become increasingly necessary. Dr. Clark documented symptoms that defied conventional diagnosis, periods of catalepsy where you would become rigid and unresponsive for hours, episodes of glossolalia where you spoke in unfamiliar languages, and instances of what he termed sympathetic manifestation, developing physical symptoms matching those of spirits you had channeled. One particularly disturbing incident occurred in late February. During a séance for the family of a miner who had died of silicosis, the miner's consumption caused by inhaling rock dust, you began coughing violently, bringing up what appeared to be stone dust despite having never entered a mine yourself. Dr. Clark's examination found your lungs clear, yet the expelled material was undeniably silicate particles mixed with blood. These physical manifestations added to your credibility but also fueled rumors about the dangers of spiritual work. Some claimed you were possessed, others that you were slowly being consumed by the spirits you channeled. You understood the truth was more complex. The boundaries between your consciousness and the spirit realm had become increasingly permeable, allowing for genuine phenomena but also making you vulnerable to psychic intrusion. Your daily routine had evolved to manage these challenges. You woke at dawn, spending an hour in meditation to strengthen your psychic boundaries. Breakfast was light, toast with honey, weak tea, perhaps an egg if you felt strong enough. Mornings were devoted to preparation, cleansing your tools, studying client notes, correspondence with other mediums around the country. Afternoons were for rest and recovery. You would often walk the streets of Georgetown, grounding yourself in physical reality. These walks revealed the town's hidden spiritual landscape, certain buildings that radiated dark energy from violent deaths, spots where the veil was naturally thin, individuals who unknowingly carried spiritual attachments. Evenings brought the work itself. Whether private consultations, group séances, or special demonstrations, each required total commitment of your mental and physical resources. You had developed a pre-séance ritual, anointing your temples with lavender oil, drinking a tonic of Margaret's herbs, and spending 15 minutes in deep breathing exercises to oxygenate your blood for the trials ahead. The séances themselves had become more elaborate as your reputation grew. Clients expected not just messages but manifestations, table levitations, spirit lights, materialized forms. While some effects were enhanced through careful preparation and theatrical techniques, increasingly genuine phenomena occurred without your conscious intervention. One evening in early March demonstrated both the power and peril of your work. The séance was for the Pemberton family, wealthy mine owners who had lost their only daughter to scarlet fever. They had requested a private session in their mansion on Tau Street, offering triple your usual fee for a full manifestation of their daughter Lucy. The Pemberton mansion was a monument to mining wealth, 3 stories of brick and granite, furnished with imports from Europe and the Orient. The séance room they had prepared was their daughter's preserved bedroom, kept exactly as it had been when she died 6 months earlier. This was dangerous territory. Rooms where children had died often retained powerful emotional imprints that could trigger uncontrolled phenomena. As soon as you entered, you felt Lucy's presence, not a conscious spirit but an echo of a life cut short, repeating patterns of her final days. The séance began normally enough. You entered trance, and Lucy's voice emerged, high and sweet, singing the lullaby her mother used to sing. Mrs. Pemberton wept openly while Mr. Pemberton gripped the table with white knuckles, his skepticism warring with desperate hope. Then something shifted. The temperature plummeted so severely that ice formed on the inside of the windows. Objects in the room began moving without anyone touching them, Lucy's dolls animated as if played with by invisible hands, her music box opened and played a discordant tune, and most disturbing, a child's figure appeared in the corner, translucent but clearly visible. But this wasn't the controlled manifestation you had planned. The spirit was drawing directly from your life force, bypassing your conscious control. You felt yourself weakening rapidly, your heartbeat becoming erratic. In desperation, you broke the cardinal rule of séances, you opened your eyes and stood abruptly, breaking the circle. The manifestation vanished instantly, but the damage was done. You collapsed, convulsing violently. Dr. Clark, who had been waiting in the next room as a precaution, rushed in to find you in the grip of what he later described as a seizure of unknown origin, accompanied by a drop in body temperature to nearly fatal levels. It took 3 days to recover from the Pemberton séance. During that time, you experienced visions that you couldn't distinguish from reality, conversations with spirits who might or might not have been present, journeys to places that existed between life and death. Bridget O'Sullivan and Miss Murphy took turns nursing you, spooning warm broth between your lips and reading from the Bible and spiritualist texts to anchor your consciousness to the physical world. When you finally recovered, you found that something fundamental had changed. Your abilities had intensified but become less controllable. Spirits would manifest around you without formal séance conditions. You would know things about people without trying to read them, their secrets, their fears, their hidden crimes. This uncontrolled mediumship was both gift and curse. It made you invaluable to those seeking truth but also made normal social interaction increasingly difficult. How could you take tea with the banker's wife when you could see the spirit of the child she had aborted standing beside her? How could you shop at the general store when the owner's deceased partner whispered about embezzled funds? The scandal broke in April 1884, just as the mountain snows began their slow melt, revealing the detritus of winter, dead animals, lost tools, and occasionally, the bodies of those who had succumbed to cold and altitude. It began with an article in the Rocky Mountain News, Denver's premier newspaper, written by a reporter named Samuel Hartley who had attended one of your séances incognito. "The Georgetown Ghost Fraud," screamed the headline. The article detailed how Hartley claimed to have discovered the mechanical tricks and chemical preparations used to deceive grieving families. He described finding phosphorescent paint on fabric in your spirit cabinet, speaking tubes hidden in the walls, and most damning, a journal, which you knew to be fabricated, containing scripts for supposed spirit communications. The article spread through Georgetown like wildfire. Within hours, angry crowds gathered outside the Hotel de Paris, demanding justice for their stolen grief. Some defended you, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Even loyal supporters like Mrs. Ashford began questioning past séances, wondering which messages had been genuine and which manufactured. You faced the crisis with a dignity that surprised even yourself. Rather than flee Georgetown as Hartley's article suggested you would, you called for a public meeting at the Opera House to address the accusations directly. The evening of April 15th, every seat was filled, with more people standing in the aisles and crowding the entrances. You took the stage alone, dressed simply in black wool without your usual theatrical touches. No flowing robes, no mystical jewelry, just Margaret Whitmore, the woman behind Madame Marguerite. "Ladies and gentlemen of Georgetown," you began, your voice carrying clearly through the hushed space, "I come before you tonight not as a medium but as a human being who has dedicated her life to serving those who grieve. Mr. Hartley's article contains both truths and falsehoods, and I owe you complete honesty about both." You proceeded to explain the reality of mediumship as you understood it. Yes, you acknowledged there were theatrical elements to some seances. The phosphorescent paint created effects that helped skeptics become open to genuine phenomena. The speaking tubes amplified real spirit voices that might otherwise be too faint to hear. These were tools, you explained, just as a doctor used instruments to heal the body, you used these implements to facilitate healing of the soul. But, you continued, meeting the eyes of those you had served, the messages themselves, the knowledge that brought you comfort, the warnings that saved lives, these came from a source beyond mere theatricality. Whether you call it spirits, the subconscious mind, or divine providence, something real occurs in that seance room. You then did something unprecedented. You offered to conduct a seance immediately, under the strictest test conditions. A committee of skeptics, including Samuel Hartley himself if he was present, could examine you in the space, bind your hands and feet, and observe from every angle. Hartley, who was indeed in the audience, couldn't refuse without appearing cowardly. A committee was quickly formed, including him, Thomas Beaumont from the newspaper, Judge Harrison, a noted skeptic, Dr. Clark, as a neutral medical observer, and surprisingly, Father Santos from the Catholic Church. The stage was cleared of everything except a simple wooden table and chairs. You submitted to a thorough search by Mrs. Chen, who confirmed you carried no hidden devices. Your hands were bound with rope, the knots sealed with wax. You sat in full view of the packed opera house, no cabinet to hide behind, no darkness to conceal trickery. What followed became known as the miracle of the Opera House in Georgetown lore. Despite the constraints, phenomena occurred that no one could explain. The table rose 3 feet off the ground while you sat motionless, hands bound. Voices emerged from empty air, recognized by multiple witnesses as deceased relatives. Most remarkably, a full message appeared on a slate board that Judge Harrison had purchased himself that afternoon and had kept in his possession, a message in his deceased wife's handwriting, referencing private jokes only they had shared. But the most powerful moment came when the spirit of Timothy O'Brien manifested. O'Brien had been killed just a week earlier in a saloon fight, and his murderer had fled to Denver. Through you, speaking in O'Brien's distinctive Irish brogue despite your bonds and observed condition, he revealed where his killer was hiding, information that proved accurate when the sheriff telegraphed Denver authorities. The seance lasted 2 hours. By its end, you were so exhausted that you fainted on stage, your body temperature dropping dangerously low. Dr. Clark's subsequent medical report, published in both local and Denver papers, documented physiological changes during the seance that defied medical explanation, your pulse stopping for full minutes while you continued speaking, your body temperature varying by 20 degrees, and stigmata-like marks appearing on your wrists where the ropes bound you, despite the bonds never tightening. Hartley left Georgetown that night without filing his follow-up story. Weeks later, a small retraction appeared in the Rocky Mountain News, acknowledging that certain phenomena witnessed cannot be explained by current scientific understanding. The scandal and its resolution transformed your practice. You instituted what you called open seances once a month, where skeptics could observe under test conditions. These sessions, while exhausting, built unassailable credibility. You also began training selected individuals in Georgetown who showed mediumistic abilities, creating a circle of legitimate practitioners who could continue the work when you inevitably moved on. Among your students was Catherine Murphy, who showed remarkable abilities in automatic writing. Under your tutelage, she learned to enter the receptive state where her hand would move without conscious control, producing messages in handwriting recognized as belonging to the deceased. Unlike some automatic writers who produced gibberish, Catherine's messages were consistently coherent and verifiable. Another student was surprisingly Mrs. Chen's nephew, David Chen, a young man who had been educated in American schools but retained connection to his Chinese spiritual heritage. He proved adept at psychometry and became a bridge between Eastern and Western spiritual practices in Georgetown. The training process was rigorous. Students spent weeks learning meditation techniques to strengthen their psychic boundaries. They studied anatomy to understand how spiritual energy moved through the body, psychology to recognize the difference between genuine spirit communication and projected subconscious desires, and even theatrical techniques to manage the performative aspects of public mediumship. You taught them your ethical code: never fabricate messages from deceased children to grieving parents, never claim knowledge of hidden wealth unless genuinely received, never use information gained through mediumship for personal profit beyond fair payment for services rendered. Most importantly, always remember that regardless of the source of the phenomena, the healing and comfort provided to clients was real and valuable. Physical training was equally important. The toll of mediumship on the body required strength and resilience. You instituted a regimen of breathing exercises adapted from Hindu pranayama techniques you had learned from a traveling mystic. Students practiced holding difficult positions to build the physical endurance needed for long séances. They learned to fast safely, purifying their systems to enhance spiritual sensitivity. The financial structure of your expanded practice became more complex. While you continued commanding high fees for private séances, you established a sliding scale for your student services, making spiritual consultation available to even the poorest residents. A portion of all earnings went into a common fund used to support mediums who became ill or injured from their work, an occupational hazard that conventional insurance wouldn't cover. By summer 1884, Georgetown had become known throughout Colorado as a center for legitimate spiritualist activity. Investigators came from universities back east to study the phenomena. The town that had once nearly driven you out now embraced you as a valuable attraction, bringing visitors and their money to local businesses. The summer of 1884 brought an unusual energy to Georgetown. The combination of increased solar activity, visible as spectacular auroras even at this latitude, and the town's high altitude seemed to enhance spiritual phenomena. Séances that might typically yield table rappings and whispered messages now produced full materializations and physical objects appearing from thin air. Your health had stabilized somewhat after instituting Margaret Chen's regimen of herbs and acupuncture, combined with high-altitude adaptation techniques learned from indigenous peoples who occasionally came to town to trade. You had gained back some weight, though your appearance retained an ethereal quality that enhanced your authority as a medium. The séance schedule had evolved into a complex weekly rhythm. Mondays were reserved for training your students, passing on both genuine techniques and the theatrical knowledge necessary for successful public mediumship. Tuesday and Thursday evenings brought group séances at the Masonic Hall, now so popular that bookings extended 2 months in advance. Wednesdays you conducted private consultations, focusing on psychological counseling as much as spirit communication. Fridays were your Chinese séances with Margaret Chen. Saturdays brought special demonstrations or investigations of reportedly haunted locations. Sundays, you rested, though even then spirits would sometimes intrude with urgent messages. It was during this period that you experienced what you would later consider the peak of your mediumistic abilities. The boundaries between worlds had become so thin for you that crossing between them required minimal effort. You could enter a full trance in seconds, channel multiple entities in succession without exhaustion, and occasionally achieve the holy grail of mediumship, independent voice phenomenon, where spirit voices spoke clearly in the room while you remained fully conscious and observing. One particularly powerful demonstration occurred during the 4th of July celebration. The entire town had gathered for picnics, speeches, and fireworks. You had been invited to conduct a patriotic séance, channeling messages from founders of the Republic and local war heroes. The event, held in the afternoon in full sunlight on a platform in the town square, eliminated any possibility of theatrical trickery. Before hundreds of witnesses, you channeled what appeared to be Benjamin Franklin, complete with his distinctive speech patterns and scientific knowledge. The entity correctly solved mathematical problems posed by the local schoolteacher, discussed electrical principles unknown to you, and made jokes in French that delighted Monsieur Dupuy. Whether this was truly Franklin's spirit, a manifestation of collective unconscious knowledge, or something else entirely, the effect was undeniable. The physical phenomena that summer reached levels that disturbed even you. Objects would materialize during séances, flowers that didn't grow in Colorado, seashells still wet with ocean water, and once, a gold locket that Mrs. Pemberton recognized as one buried with her mother in Ohio 20 years earlier. These apports, as spiritualists called them, defied physical laws. How could solid objects travel instantaneously across space? Dr. Clark documented everything with scientific rigor. He weighed you before and after séances, finding that you sometimes lost 5 to 10 pounds during a single session, weight that would return gradually over the following days. He measured electromagnetic fluctuations in the séance room using equipment borrowed from the Colorado School of Mines. He photographed the materialized objects, though curiously, they often appeared semi-transparent on the photographic plates despite being solid to touch. Your journal from this period reveals the psychological toll of such intense mediumship. You wrote of dreams where you couldn't distinguish between living and dead visitors, of walking through Georgetown and seeing it simultaneously in its present state and various temporal layers, the indigenous peoples who first used the valley, the future ruins it would become. You experienced what you called temporal bleed, knowing events before they occurred, not as prophecy but as memory. One entry, dated July 20th, 1884, is particularly revealing. The boundaries dissolve more each day. This morning, I watched my own death, not as future possibility but as accomplished fact occurring simultaneously with my present existence. I saw myself, aged and frail, in a sanatorium in California, breathing my last while also sitting here in my room writing these words. Time is not the linear progression we perceive but an eternal present in which all moments exist simultaneously. The spirits know this. They exist in this eternal now, which is why they can speak of past and future with equal clarity. But maintaining consciousness across these multiple states is fragmenting my human psyche. I fear I am becoming something other than human, not more or less, but fundamentally different. Despite or perhaps because of these experiences, your effectiveness as a healer of grief reached new heights. You developed an ability to provide exactly what each client needed, not always what they wanted, but what would bring genuine peace. For some, this meant dramatic proof of survival after death. For others, it meant gentle suggestion that their loved ones wanted them to release grief and embrace life. Your work with the Chinese community deepened during this period. Margaret Chen had taught you enough Cantonese to conduct basic communications without translation. More importantly, you had learned to navigate the different cultural expectations around death and spirits. Chinese clients didn't seek proof of survival, that was assumed. They needed to know their ancestors were properly honored, that neglected duties could still be fulfilled. One particularly moving case involved the Huang family, whose patriarch had died in a mine collapse before he could pass on the location of gold he had hidden, his life savings intended to bring his family from China. Through a combination of séance work and what you had learned to call psychometric archaeology, Reading the emotional imprints left on objects and locations, you led them to a cache hidden in an abandoned mine shaft. The discovery allowed them to reunite their family, bringing wife and children from Guangdong province to Georgetown. Your students were developing rapidly under the intense spiritual atmosphere of that summer. Catherine Murphy had begun achieving independent automatic writing. Her hand would write messages while she maintained a completely separate conversation. David Chin discovered he could see auras around living people that revealed their health status and emotional state. A new student, James Whitehorse, a mixed-blood Arapaho man who worked as a translator, showed remarkable ability in prophetic dreams that proved accurate with disturbing regularity. The training sessions had evolved into something resembling a mystery school of ancient times. You taught not just techniques but philosophy, the nature of consciousness, the structure of reality, the moral obligations of those who served as bridges between worlds. You shared the Hermetic principles you had learned from European occultists, the energy cultivation techniques from Chinese tradition, and the vision quest practices James Whitehorse brought from his mother's people. As autumn arrived in Georgetown, painting the aspens gold once again, you had been in the mountain town for just over a year. The cycle of seasons at altitude had completed itself, and you had learned to read the spiritual rhythms that accompanied the physical changes. Fall, you discovered, was when the veil was thinnest, not just on Halloween as tradition suggested, but throughout the season of dying light. Your practice had evolved into something that transcended traditional mediumship. You had become what some called a death doula, helping not just the living cope with loss but occasionally assisting spirits themselves in their transition. Several times, you had been called to deathbeds where your presence seemed to ease the passing, making visible to the dying the spirits of loved ones waiting to guide them across. One such case involved Johannes Müller, the German carpenter who had modified your spirit cabinet. He was dying of pneumonia, struggling against the inevitable transition. His wife begged you to come, not for a séance but simply for your presence. When you arrived at their modest home on Alpine Street, you found Johannes delirious with fever, speaking rapidly in German to invisible presences. You sat beside his bed, entering a light trance that allowed you to perceive what he was seeing. The room was crowded with spirits, his parents, siblings who had died in childhood, fellow craftsmen who had preceded him. But Johannes couldn't see them clearly through his fear and fever. You served as translator, describing the waiting spirits to him, conveying their messages of welcome and assurance. Your father says the workshop is prepared, you told him, seeing in your mind's eye a celestial version of a carpenter's shop. Your mother has made sauerbraten for your arrival feast. Whether these visions were literal truth or symbolic representations shaped by Johannes's dying mind, they brought him peace. He passed quietly an hour later, a smile on his weathered face. Word of your deathbed assistance spread, and soon you were being called to support the dying as often as to comfort the grieving. This work, which you never charged for, was perhaps the most genuine and sacred of all your services. There was no possibility of fraud when dealing with the actively dying. Either you could perceive and communicate with the gathering spirits or you couldn't. Dr. Clark often accompanied you on these visits, documenting what he called the phenomenology of death. He noted consistent patterns. The dying often reported seeing deceased relatives days before passing. The room temperature would fluctuate dramatically in the final hours, and there was frequently a moment of lucidity just before death when even the most confused patients would speak clearly of what they were seeing on the other side. Your regular séances had also evolved. The theatrical elements had largely fallen away, replaced by genuine phenomena that required no enhancement. Your students often joined you, creating what you called a battery circle, their combined psychic energy amplifying your own abilities. These group mediumship sessions produced phenomena that none of you could achieve alone. One evening in early October, during a séance for the families of miners killed in a recent cave-in, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of individual spirits manifesting sequentially, all 7 victims appeared simultaneously, visible to everyone present as translucent but detailed figures. They stood in a line, each recognizable to their families, and spoke in chorus, their voices harmonizing like a Greek chorus from ancient tragedy. "We did not suffer," they said as one. "Death came as darkness and immediately opened into light. We watch over you still, guardians in the mountains. Our bodies feed the earth that gave us silver. Our spirits soar above the peaks. Grieve not for us but for yourselves, temporarily separated from this glory." The manifestation lasted only moments, but its impact was profound. Several witnesses, including the previously skeptical Judge Harrison, publicly declared their conversion to spiritualism. The event was reported in newspapers as far away as San Francisco and New York, bringing a new wave of investigators and seekers to Georgetown. Among these visitors was Professor William Jameson from Harvard University, one of the first academics to seriously study psychic phenomena. He spent 2 weeks observing your séances, conducting tests, and interviewing witnesses. His subsequent report, while stopping short of confirming the reality of spirit communication, acknowledged that the phenomena he observed could not be explained by current scientific understanding or attributed to fraud. The professor was particularly intrigued by your ability to provide information that could be verified but which you had no normal means of knowing. During a test séance, you provided the location of a will hidden in a Boston law office, the combination to a safe in Denver, and the diagnosis of a medical condition that a participant had not yet discovered but which was confirmed by subsequent examination. Either Madame Marguerite possesses telepathic abilities that allow her to read minds at a distance, Professor Jameson wrote, or she is indeed in communication with intelligences that possess knowledge beyond the physical. Either possibility revolutionizes our understanding of consciousness and reality. Your financial situation had become quite comfortable by autumn 1884. You had accumulated savings of nearly $2,000, a small fortune by Georgetown standards. But wealth had never been your primary motivation, and you began distributing more of your earnings to charitable causes. You established a fund for miners' widows, contributed to the building of a new hospital, and quietly paid the debts of families struggling with medical bills. This generosity, combined with your genuine service to the community, had transformed your status from suspicious outsider to beloved, if mysterious, fixture of Georgetown life. Children would wave when you passed on the street, though some crossed themselves as their parents had taught them. Miners would tip their caps respectfully, many wearing small crystals you had charged for protection in the dangerous underground. Even the Protestant ministers, while theologically opposed to spiritualism, acknowledged the comfort you brought to grieving parishioners. Your relationship with the various religious communities had evolved into mutual, if cautious, respect. Father Santos occasionally consulted you about parishioners experiencing what the Catholic Church called mystical phenomena, but which you recognized as spontaneous mediumship. Rabbi Goldman from the small Jewish community had attended several séances and declared that your work aligned with Kabbalistic teachings about the soul's journey after death. Only Reverend Blackwood from the Methodist Church remained openly hostile, preaching sermons about the dangers of necromancy and false prophets. As winter 1884 descended upon Georgetown once again, you found yourself reflecting on the cycles within cycles that governed both physical and spiritual existence. The town settled into its winter rhythm, shorter days, longer nights, the constant battle against cold and isolation. For you, this second winter brought a deepening understanding of your role in this mountain community and the price of serving as a bridge between worlds. Your daily routine had adapted to the harsh season. Morning séances were moved to afternoon when the weak winter sun provided maximum warmth. Evening sessions required massive amounts of coal to heat the Masonic Hall adequately. The spirits might not feel cold, but living participants certainly did. You discovered that extreme cold actually enhanced certain phenomena, particularly the materialization of ectoplasm, that mysterious substance that emerged from mediums during deep trances and could form into recognizable shapes and faces. Dr. Clark had become fascinated by ectoplasm, attempting to study it scientifically. During one December séance, he was permitted to take a sample of the gauze-like substance that had emerged from your mouth and formed into a partial human figure. His attempts to preserve and analyze it failed. The material dissolved within minutes of being separated from your body, leaving only a faint residue that chemical analysis revealed to be primarily composed of organic compounds similar to those found in human saliva and epithelial cells, though with unusual crystalline structures that couldn't be explained. Your health management had become a precise science. Margaret Chin prepared special winter tonics containing ginseng for energy, rhodiola for altitude adaptation, and mysterious ingredients she wouldn't reveal but which she assured you had been used by Taoist masters for centuries to maintain spiritual sensitivity while preserving physical vitality. You consumed nearly 4,000 calories daily during active periods, your body burning through energy at a rate that would have been concerning if not for its consistency and your general stability. The financial aspects of your practice had evolved into a complex economy. Your various services now generated roughly $900 monthly in winter, slightly less than summer due to reduced attendance from travelers. Your expenses had also increased. Heating costs for séance rooms, $60. Winter clothing and equipment, $50. Enhanced food and medical supplies, $80. Charitable giving, expected to increase during harsh winters, $100. Student support fund, $75. Research and documentation, $40. Emergency reserves, $300. Personal expenses, $195. You had also begun investing in Georgetown's future, purchasing shares in mining companies based on spiritual guidance about which claims would prove profitable. This blending of spiritual and material success troubled some purists in the spiritualist movement, but you saw no contradiction. The spirits existed in a realm where all knowledge was available. Why shouldn't they provide practical as well as emotional guidance? One investment proved particularly prescient. During a séance, a spirit claiming to be a deceased prospector had insisted that the worthless Pelican mine extension contained a rich silver vein hidden behind a wall of barren rock. You invested $200 for a small share and convinced Mrs. Ashford to encourage her husband to continue excavation. When they broke through in January 1885, they discovered one of the richest silver deposits in the district. Your share would eventually yield over $10,000. But wealth brought complications. Some accused you of using insider information rather than spiritual guidance. Others suggested you were in league with mine owners, providing false spiritual endorsements for their claims. You navigated these accusations carefully, always ensuring that any investment advice given during séances came spontaneously from spirits rather than being solicited, and refusing to conduct séances specifically for financial guidance. Your students had developed into accomplished mediums in their own right. Catherine Murphy now conducted her own séances for Georgetown's middle class, charging modest fees that made spiritual consultation accessible to those who couldn't afford your services. David Chin had synthesized Eastern and Western techniques into a unique practice that attracted both communities. James Whitehorse offered prophetic consultations that helped people navigate future challenges. The training had evolved into what resembled a formal apprenticeship. New students began with 3 months of preparatory work, meditation, energy cultivation, psychological study. Only then were they introduced to actual spirit communication, starting with the safest methods like automatic writing and gradually progressing to trance mediumship. You insisted each student understand both the genuine spiritual techniques and the theatrical methods that might be necessary to maintain faith when spirits were reluctant to communicate. Never forget, you told them during one training session, our primary purpose is healing and comfort. Whether the messages come from spirits, from our own intuitive understanding, or from careful observation of our clients' needs, what matters is that we provide genuine service. The moment you prioritize profit over purpose, you lose not just your integrity but often your abilities as well. This philosophy was tested when one student, Thomas Garrett, a former bank clerk who showed promise in psychometry, began conducting private séances focused on finding hidden wealth and predicting mining claims. His apparent successes attracted wealthy clients, but you sensed something amiss. Investigation revealed he was colluding with a corrupt assayer who provided advance information about ore samples. You expelled him from your circle, publicly dissociating yourself from his practices. He left Georgetown shortly after, his reputation destroyed. The incident reinforced the importance of ethical standards in spiritualist practice. You instituted a formal code of conduct for your students, modeled on medical ethics but adapted to the unique challenges of mediumship. This code prohibited using spiritual consultations for personal financial gain beyond fair payment, required honest acknowledgement when no genuine spirit communication occurred, and mandated reporting of any criminal knowledge gained during séances to appropriate authorities. By spring 1885, you had been in Georgetown for 18 months, a lifetime in the boom and bust cycles of mining towns. The silver market remained strong, keeping the town prosperous and your services in demand. But you felt a shift coming, both in the spiritual atmosphere and in your own journey. Your abilities had reached a plateau, not diminishing but no longer expanding as they had during your first year. The constant exposure to death, grief, and the spiritual realm had created what you described in your journal as psychic calcification, a protective hardening that preserved your sanity but limited your sensitivity. You could still conduct powerful séances, still channel clear messages, but the spontaneous phenomena that had marked your peak had become less frequent. This concerned Dr. Clark, who had documented a correlation between your declining spontaneous manifestations and improvement in your physical health. It's as if your body has learned to protect itself from the spiritual intrusions, he observed. You're healthier but less permeable to the other side. You understood this as a natural cycle. No medium could maintain peak sensitivity indefinitely without risking complete dissolution of the self. Your mentor, Madame Thornton, had warned you about this phase, calling it the spiritualist's autumn, a time when raw ability gave way to refined technique and wisdom. Your role in Georgetown had evolved accordingly. Rather than serving primarily as a conduit for spirits, you had become a counselor, teacher, and community figure. People sought your advice on matters both spiritual and practical. You mediated disputes using insights gained from reading the parties' emotional states. You counseled couples whose relationships had been strained by loss. You helped parents understand children who showed signs of mediumistic abilities. The Chinese community had particularly benefited from your expanded role. Working with Margaret Chen, you had established what you called ancestor circles, regular gatherings where Chinese families could honor their dead through a blend of traditional practices and Western spiritualist techniques. These circles provided not just spiritual comfort but social support for a marginalized community. One case from this period illustrates the evolution of your practice. The Ling family had lost their eldest son in a mining accident, but the circumstances were suspicious. The mine owners claimed he had been careless, denying death benefits. Through a combination of séance work, investigation of physical evidence guided by spiritual insight, and careful documentation, you helped prove that faulty equipment, not worker error, had caused the death. The resulting settlement allowed the family to bring relatives from China and establish a successful restaurant. your financial situation had become quite comfortable. Between your regular practice, investments guided by spiritual insight, and occasional windfalls from grateful clients, you had accumulated wealth exceeding $5,000. This fortune, enormous by the standards of most Georgetown residents, brought both opportunities and responsibilities. You established several charitable initiatives. The Spiritualist Healing Fund provided free séances for those who couldn't afford them. The miner's widow pension supplemented the meter support provided by mining companies. The Georgetown Library received donations of spiritualist and philosophical texts. Most quietly, you paid for several young people to attend college in Denver, believing education would serve them better than silver fever. But prosperity couldn't mask growing tensions in Georgetown. The silver market showed signs of instability. Labor disputes had become more frequent and violent. The spiritual atmosphere had grown heavy with accumulated grief and unresolved conflicts. You sensed that your time in the Silver Queen was drawing to a close. The sign came during the summer solstice séance of 1885. You had planned another demonstration of full materialization, hoping to recapture the dramatic success of the previous year. The evening began normally, with the expected participants gathering in the Masonic Hall. But as you entered trance, something different occurred. Instead of individual spirits manifesting, you experienced what you later described as cosmic consciousness, a state where you perceived all of Georgetown's history simultaneously. You saw the valley before human habitation, witnessed the arrival of indigenous peoples, observed Spanish explorers, watched the discovery of silver and the town's rapid growth. But you also saw its future, the silver crash that would come, the town's decline, its eventual transformation into a tourist destination trading on nostalgia for its mining past. When you emerged from trance, you had been unconscious for 3 hours. The assembled witnesses described extraordinary phenomena, the room filling with a golden light, voices speaking in languages spanning centuries, visions of Georgetown's past and future appearing like magic lantern shows on the walls. But what struck them most was your pronouncement upon awakening. The spirits have shown me that my work here is complete. Georgetown has learned what it needed to learn. The seeds of understanding between worlds have been planted. They will grow long after I have departed. You left Georgetown in September 1885, as the aspens turned gold one final time during your residency. The departure was neither sudden nor dramatic. You had spent weeks preparing your students to continue the work, transferring your knowledge and ensuring the spiritual infrastructure you had created would persist. Your final séance in Georgetown was public and free, held in the Opera House before an audience of nearly 300 people. Rather than dramatic manifestations, you offered simple, clear messages from the other side, focusing on healing and hope. The evening concluded with what witnesses described as a blessing of light, a gentle, warm illumination that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, leaving all present with a profound sense of peace. Dr. Clark published his complete notes on your Georgetown period in a medical journal, contributing to the early scientific study of consciousness and paranormal phenomena. His documentation of the physical effects of mediumship on your body would be cited by researchers for decades to come. Margaret Chen continued the Chinese ancestor circles, eventually training her daughter in the combined Eastern-Western approach you had developed together. The practice would persist in Georgetown's Chinese community until the last of the original immigrant generation passed away in the 1920s. Catherine Murphy established herself as Georgetown's primary medium after your departure, maintaining the ethical standards and genuine care for clients you had instilled. She would continue practicing until her death in 1898, never achieving your level of dramatic phenomena but providing steady, reliable comfort to the grieving. The Georgetown Spiritualist Society continued meeting regularly until the silver crash of 1893 devastated the town's economy. Even then, informal circles persisted, gathering in private homes to attempt communication with the other side. Some claim that on quiet nights, especially during the winter solstice, your presence could still be felt in the old Masonic Hall, a gentle guidance for those attempting to breach the veil. Your investments, managed by a trust you established before leaving, continued supporting Georgetown's charitable institutions for years. The Miners' Widow Fund operated until 1910, providing crucial support to hundreds of families. The Georgetown Library's collection of spiritualist texts, donated by you, would become one of the most comprehensive in the Rocky Mountain region. As for you, Margaret Whitmore, also known as Madame Marguerite, you continued your journey westward, eventually settling in California, where the combination of mild climate and growing spiritualist movement provided ideal conditions for your evolved practice. You would live until 1917, passing quietly in a San Francisco sanatorium, attended by students and believers who claimed that at the moment of your death, the room filled with spirits welcoming you to the other side you had spent your life exploring. But in Georgetown, your legacy lived on in more than memory or institution. You had changed the town's relationship with death, grief, and the possibility of continuation beyond physical existence. Families found comfort in the techniques you had taught, whether or not spirits actually communicated. The bereaved learned to honor their grief while not being consumed by it. The dying faced their transition with less fear, believing in the continuity you had demonstrated. The true measure of your success as a séance leader in Wild West Georgetown wasn't in the dramatic phenomena witnessed or the wealth accumulated, but in the subtle shift in consciousness you facilitated. You had shown a rough mining town that there was more to existence than the material wealth they pulled from the earth. You had demonstrated that love, consciousness, and connection could transcend the apparent finality of death. Whether the spirits you channeled were genuine entities from beyond, manifestations of the collective unconscious, or elaborate constructions of a gifted performer's mind, the healing they brought was undeniably real. In a place where death was commonplace and grief universal, you had provided a service as essential as any doctor or minister, the assurance that death was not the end, that love persisted, and that the boundaries between worlds were far more permeable than most dared to believe. The Georgetown you left behind was different from the one you had entered. It had been touched by mystery, open to possibility, and given tools to navigate the eternal human challenges of loss and longing. Your legacy wasn't just in the séances conducted or the spirits channeled, but in the transformation of how a community understood the deepest mysteries of existence. As the train carried you away from Georgetown that September day, following the same mountain passes that had brought you there 2 years earlier, you carried with you the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of séances, thousands of spirit communications, and countless moments of genuine human connection facilitated by your unique gifts. The mountains that had amplified your abilities, the altitude that had challenged your physical form, and the people who had trusted you with their deepest griefs had all contributed to your evolution from traveling medium to something more, a true bridge between worlds. Georgetown would boom for a few more years before the silver crash brought decline. The town would shrink, many buildings would be abandoned, and the opera house where you had conducted your most dramatic demonstrations would eventually burn. But on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the veil thin, locals would gather in the rebuilt Masonic Hall, join hands around a table, and attempt to reach across the boundaries of death, using techniques you had taught them. And sometimes, just sometimes, they would succeed. The mountains remember everything, every life, every death, every moment of joy and sorrow. And in those memories, preserved in the thin air and ancient rocks, your work continues. For you had shown that in the rarefied atmosphere of Georgetown, Colorado, at 8,500 feet above sea level, the boundaries between earth and spirit, between living and dead, between possible and impossible, could indeed dissolve. The spirits you served, whether real or imagined, had found their voice through you. And in finding that voice, they had given voice to the hopes, fears, loves, and losses of entire communities struggling to find meaning in a harsh and beautiful landscape where death was always present but never final. This is the legacy of a seance leader in the Wild West, not the gold or silver pulled from the ground, but the comfort pulled from the very air, the messages that crossed impossible boundaries, and the demonstration that even in the roughest mining camp, even among the most practical and skeptical of people, there remained a hunger for connection with something beyond the material world. And so your story ends where it began, with the eternal human need to know that death is not the end, that love survives, and that somewhere, in dimensions beyond our normal perception, those we have lost continue on, waiting for the day when we too will cross that threshold and understand the mysteries that you spent your life exploring. Sleep now, and know that the spirits are at peace, the veil is secure, and the work continues in other hands, in other places, but always with the same purpose, to comfort the grieving, to prove continuity beyond death, and to serve as bridges between the worlds that are not as separate as they seem. In the silence of the mountains, in the whisper of wind through abandoned mine shafts, in the memories of those who witnessed your work, the seances continue. And perhaps, if you listen carefully in that drowsy space between waking and sleeping, you might hear them still, the spirits of Georgetown, speaking across time and space, reminding us that nothing is ever truly lost, that all who have lived continue on in forms we can barely imagine, and that the work of the medium, the bridge builder, the one who sees between worlds, is eternal and essential. Rest well, knowing that this story, like all stories of those who dared appear beyond the veil, never truly ends. It simply transforms, like energy that can neither be created nor destroyed, only changed from one form to another. And in that transformation, in that eternal dance between seen and unseen, known and unknown, living and dead, the real magic lives on. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be filled with the peaceful presence of those who have gone before, watching over you from dimensions where love never dies and every ending is also a beginning.